So, my friends, you just beat Baldurs Gate 3 and you are one of those 1 million plus lucky people who have never played a CRPG before, and now you're left with that sinking feeling in your stomach. What do I do now? Am I just going to open my wallet again and go back to some battle pass, microtransaction-driven corporate dribble game? Or has the bar been raised and you're ready to have another quality gaming experience that respects your time? Well, I have good news. I've made this video for you, and the really good news is there's been a renaissance of CRPGs in the last 5 to 10 years. And on top of that, there's a bunch of older masterpieces to pick from. So the world is not over. There's an entire genre open to you now, and I want you to be able to pick from the best of the best and have a wonderful time. Now, personally, I've always loved CRPGs. I love them for two reasons. First and foremost, they feel to me like kind of a natural extension of that old school JRPG I played when I was a kid. I'm talking Squaresoft here. I'm talking Final Fantasy 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'm talking Chrono Cross, Super Mario RPG, Xenogears, Lunar Silver Star Story. Games that give you this incredible story, compelling characters, and a decently complex combat system, and you have those breathtaking moments, games that you play and you never forget. And sadly, over the years, these games that were once so amazing have kind of gone into decline. Now, if you want the reason for that and you want to talk about Squaresoft specifically, I can lay that directly on the altar of the Squaresoft and Square Enix merger. The evidence of which you can just go on Wikipedia and pull up a list of games that Squaresoft made, and then the list of games they made after the merger. And oh my god, it's like watching the crucifixion of creative genius. One is a list of timeless masterpieces, the other is a list of 20 years worth of sequels, prequels, remakes, and mostly crap besides a few anomalies here and there like Final Fantasy XIV, and we'll talk about that later. But what a shock, all of a sudden they decided to put somebody who cared about quality and was passionate in charge of that. In fact, that whole list kind of reminds me of modern Hollywood.
Blizzard is dead. It is a corpse. It is a corpse being puppeteered by Activision and Bobby Kotick. And it's going to be used as basically a factory to put the Blizzard stamp on things and stoke nostalgia to get sales. And that's it.
And then speaking of modern Final Fantasy, for me in the last couple of years, it just seems like they're always this weird royal soap opera that's incomprehensible and murky, and it's always starring Noctis, Meridius, Decimus, Maximus, Crystallis, Novalis, and his 4 buddies who are all dressed exactly the same, and they're always on some dramatic royal adventure, and I just could care less. And on top of that, the combat seems to be shifting into something more like a cinematic experience where you mash buttons at the right time, like Azura's Wrath. And don't get me wrong, Azura's Wrath is an awesome game, but it wasn't really what I signed on for. But we're not here to complain about the death of old-school JRPGs. We're here to celebrate the birth of this new era of CRPGs that you have joined. And as mentioned earlier, the other reason I love CRPGs is I've always been obsessed and interested with character building. You know, you're given this intricate, interesting system of full classes and archetypes and feats and abilities, and you combine these and you can make interesting character builds in parties and thus increase your power in combat and do interesting things. And that's like the god's ambrosia to me. And I've really never understood the argument in modern JRPGs that turn-based games somehow turn off and you're not able to reach out to a broader audience. I mean, Did Pokemon not appeal to a broader audience? Turn-based Pokemon? Was that a disaster? You know, I don't think turn-based has to die to reach out to 1 million people. Now, one last thing before I get on with the list. I do think Baldurs Gate 3 is a masterpiece. Though I will say I think there are a few cracks in the Mona Lisa. For me, the biggest issue with the game is the long resting system, which is kind of counterintuitive because there are so many story beats and cutscenes that are based on you long resting, and yet at the same time, the game actively discourages you from long resting due to both food consumption and, more importantly, there's all these time-based quests. So if you long rest, you might fail the quest, but at the same time, you might miss a cutscene. So I think that was kind of a miss there, but it's also something that can be ironed out in the long run. My other minor complaint would be I think the game does start a little slow both combat-wise and narratively. For me personally, I don't know about you, it took me till about the end of Act 2 to really be thrust into this story, just to be like, holy crap, this is awesome, what's going on? I am interested. But the problem there is, that's probably 40 hours away from the start of the game. So most of the beginning of the game is kind of held loosely together by the overarching Illithid plot. But in general, there's just a lot of little incidents and side stories carrying you on, leading you up to this moment at the end of Act 2. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, the open nature of the game means you can go anywhere and do so many things, and that can lead to kind of a narratively unbalanced experience in terms of pacing. If you decide to do everything on the map, you might not be as into the story as you would like to be. On top of that, early game combat is also a little slow, and this is actually because the game is based on the D&D combat system, which, since time immemorial, has had issues with, let's say, level 1 to 5, where essentially you walk forward and smack something once every turn. So, don't get me wrong, it does take a while to get your party up to speed and start doing really interesting things, but then again, level 1 to 5, 6, 7, 8, that's 40 hours, baby. Now, there's no doubt a bunch of interesting things you can do in combat, but at the same time, 99% of the player base might miss these things. You know, shoving, pushing, exploding barrels, all kinds of stuff. But all these minor complaints aside, this game is still a goddamn masterpiece, and I'm sure you would agree with me. So, enough complaining. Here is my list of must-play CRPGs for the newly baptized Baldurs Gate enthusiast. We're going to start with modern CRPGs, which I think is obviously an easier jumping-off point for players new to this genre. The first masterpiece that springs to mind is, of course, Divinity Original Sin 2, which is a terrible title for an amazing game. Now, the same reason you might want to play this next is also the same reason you might not want to play this, and that is it is made by Larian, the same company that has made Baldurs Gate 3. It's utilizing the same game engine, and they both feel very similar to play. It's very much the same style. The really good news here is Divinity Original Sin 2, what a mouthful, is its own unique game. It's not chained to the D&D mythos or story, and I think more importantly, it's not chained to the D&D combat system. Now, the game is doing its own thing. It has its own unique characters, its own unique backstory, and it has a really interesting and compelling story. And an important note for the modern audiences here, the game's dialogue is 99% voiced, which is a nice thing. It's not necessary, especially when you get into these old school CRPGs that don't have that, but in modern times, it's really nice. It can really flesh out the characters as long as it's done well. The irony here is, once again, it's a masterpiece, but I think it actually suffers from the reverse problem that Baldurs Gate 3 has. I actually think the beginning of Divinity Original Sin 2 is super compelling in its side stories. You're actually really invested on what's going on, but as things progress towards the end game, it does get a bit muddled and a bit more unclear, and unfortunately that's heavily dependent on the origin character that you pick. I think if you pick Fane, the skeleton guy, you're much more involved in the main story, while the other characters have a lot more side stories going on. Origin characters is a whole nother video and a whole nother argument. I'm not sure. Every other CRPG, JRPG, it's just always make the main character, but it does lead to interesting multiple playthrough options. However, ultimately, these are all minor complaints in what is a game that is ultimately probably as good as Baldurs Gate 3. It's really, really good. And an important note here, Divinity Original Sin 2 also utilizes the same turn-based system, while almost every other CRPG on this list does not. Most CRPGs, even the older ones, utilize a pause at any moment system. You can press the spacebar, whatever, and you pause combat and you can direct your characters to do actions. Similar if you ever played the Grandia series. And to be honest with you, I really like this combat system. I find it almost more enjoyable in a way, but I am very happy that Divinity Original Sin 2 does use turn-based for the specific reason that Divinity Original Sin 2's turn-based system is awesome. Larian managed to make one of the most interesting turn-based combat systems I think I've ever seen in any game. And once again, because it's not really handcuffed to the old D&D system. There's a lot of emphasis on environment in the context of this game, and there are a ton of spells, there's a ton of character customizations, but what I mean by environment is you can have your character cast a rock spell that hits them and creates a pool of oil underneath them. Then you can have another character cast a poison bolt that turns that oil into poison gas. And then you can have another character cast a firebolt that explodes the poison gas and sets everything on fire while they're poisoned. Same thing on the flip side. You can create water pools, freeze them, electrify them. And it's really interesting. It's really fun. And to be honest with you, I enjoy it more than Baldurs Gate 3 turn-based. That is by far one of the biggest highlights of Divinity Original Sin 2. So in conclusion, put this game on your list, play it. It's worth your time. It's worth your money. The second game I want to talk about is the primary reason why I made this video in the first place, and that is Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. Now, luckily, unlike Divinity Original Sin 2, from here on out, I can just call it Deadfire. Now, the reason why I want to talk to you about this game is, since it has come out, I have never felt more strongly that I think this is one of the most underrated CRPGs ever made. It's incredible. And, I constantly read these, rankings, long lists, top 20 CRPGs, and for some inexplicable reason, this is always usually ranked underneath the original Pillars of Eternity 1. Maybe that gets an S and this gets a triple A. And don't get me wrong, the original Pillars of Eternity is an excellent game, and when you run out of all the games on this list, you should probably play it. But like a lot of games I'm going to talk about, like Baldurs Gate 2, like Divinity Original Sin 2, the important thing about Deadfire as a sequel is it took everything from the original Pillars of Eternity and perfected it, made it 10 times better in my opinion, and this game is incredible. My biggest issue with Pillars of Eternity 1 is in the storytelling and the dialogue. The combat is good, the setting is beautiful, it's very Lord of the Rings CRPG-esque, but the game's story and dialogue is delivered to you in a very tell, not show fashion. The big issue here is almost every character interaction you have and every dialogue are these long paragraphs of exposition, which you have to plow through and, to be honest, are not particularly interesting or entertaining. On top of that, it isn't voiced, at least most of it isn't, which, I'm sorry, is a downside in a modern game. And the game, for some reason, just assumes you're going to be interested just because. And that is what the Deadfire sequel improved upon so much. They made the dialogue and story so much more palatable. As opposed to these long exposition dumps, it's presented to you in short, snappy, interesting dialogue that draws you into the world. And the characters are constantly interacting with each other. It's 99% voice acted, and the game is so much better for it. On top of everything else, I just love this game. If you ask me right now on the spot to rank the best CRPGs of all time, I would put Deadfire right next to Baldurs Gate 3. It's that good. It's such an amazing game, and if you're watching this video, please play this CRPG. Play it. Try it. I challenge you.
Challenge you! Alright?
The setting is absolutely phenomenal. It's definitely not traditional Lord of the Rings. It's this giant, sprawling kind of island, ocean land culture. There's all these nations, and every island you can visit on your ship has a place. It has a dungeon, it has a town, it has a story that you can interact with and do side quests. And more importantly, one of the biggest parts of the game is this gigantic island city, which is very reminiscent to Baldurs Gate and Baldurs Gate 3. In this city, you can go from section to section. It's massive, and you never know when there's going to be another merchant, another story, another dungeon, what is waiting for you around the corner. And the setting of this game is so intricately constructed. It's kind of a mix of both interactual objects and architecture and pre-rendered backgrounds with these wonderful, vibrant colors, which really hits you right in the feels. You feel like you're playing an old Squaresoft RPG. And the really nice thing when you kind of combine these two things in pre-rendered backgrounds is it gives the game the freedom to give each area its own style, its own personality. The story's really interesting, the characters are interesting. As I think I already mentioned, the whole game is voice acted, and it's done so well. I think, honestly, you're cheating yourself if you don't pick up Mayorua and Tehiku. In fact, I think I went back and played it a second time 3 or 4 years later. That's kind of my loop. It's like reading a good book. And I was determined to pick different companions, but god damn it, they're just so good. They ended up in my party once again. There's also a ton of interaction between your party members, which really brings life to the game. One of, just a slight minor tweak with Baldurs Gate 3, unless you're on a specific side quest that involves that companion, in general, they're pretty quiet. But in this game, they're always chatting, they're always talking, and that really sucks you into the world. And like the best CRPGs, if you make horrible choices and horrible decisions, eventually your party members start leaving you for distasteful acts you might commit. And, that's always fun to keep you on your toes. The combat system is fabulous. As mentioned before, it's a pause at any time during the battle as opposed to turn-based. But just like Divinity Original Sin 2, it's doing its own thing. It's created its own unique combat system, its own classes, subclasses, archetypes, and you can do multi-classing. So it's somewhat simplified when compared to something like D&D 3.5, but it's got depth to it. Another special mention when it comes to combat, this probably has the most interesting, advanced, and customizable AI system that I've ever seen in a CRPG. And what I mean by this is, well, you can absolutely manually control your characters. You can also set up commands for your companions, and it's almost like it's Photoshop, it's layers, it's priorities. So you can go in and create custom command chains, and just for example, it's like, if HP is above 30%, teleport and use X skill on the lowest armor class enemy. But then you can set up a subcommand above that that's if HP is below 30%, heal self. Now these are two very basic commands, but it gets really complex and interesting. For instance, if X level spell is cast in your vicinity, immediately cast counterspell or silence. And this alone you can spend hours doing and playing with. It's really cool. But once again, this is a totally optional aspect of the game, but it is really interesting how much control it gives you to be able to basically automatically have your party do what you want it to do. By far, my biggest gripe when it comes to Deadfire is, for some reason, not only the developers but players seem to be under the assumption that you need to play the original Pillars of Eternity 1 to understand or get involved with Deadfire. This is such a huge mistake. It's just like Baldurs Gate 3. Do you need to play Baldurs Gate 2 to understand Baldurs Gate 3? No, not even close. And it's the same here, but for some reason the game, especially at the beginning, makes you feel like this is necessary. And I don't understand why the developer did this, but you wake up just the first 2 minutes of the game in this kind of death realm. You talk to the goddess of death, and she asks you to start your adventure and then load your previous save from Pillars of Eternity 1. Now, all this does is it takes your choices from Pillars of Eternity 1 and maybe alters, 10, 20 lines of dialogue throughout your 100-hour playthrough, based on whether or not you're a bad person, you're a neutral, you're chaotic good, you're true evil, whatever. But I just think it was such a mistake to even give the expectation that you would need to play the original to play this. You absolutely don't. Just jump right into it. It's great. And just like Baldurs Gate 3, there's going to be characters coming back from Baldurs Gate 2, like Jaheira, like Minsk. Did you need to see them in Baldurs Gate 2? No. As a matter of fact, I think nostalgia in general is a bad crutch to rely on. When I play Baldurs Gate 3, it's been a while since I played BG2. I don't give a shit about Jaheira. I don't care about Minsk. If anything, trying to suck that nostalgia in takes away from the momentum of the main game the story's trying to tell. So to conclude here, go play it. Play Pillars of Eternity 1. It's a good game. It's just not nearly as good as Deadfire. And once again, how I look at the, Shadowrun Hong Kong is a cyberpunk CRPG. Very indie, not a huge game, very simple. I see this rated higher, and I cannot, what? What? Also, special mention here, definitely get the expansions. They add 40% to the game's length. Also, there's super bosses in the game. There's tons of improvements they've made over the years. And the expansions themselves are probably $4.99 each. You can probably get the whole bundle for $20. Go play it. Last but not least on our modern CRPG list, though I am going to have some special mentions at the end, I cannot miss Pathfinder. Now, Pathfinder is interesting because the Pathfinder tabletop game is actually an extension of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition. Now, this may not interest you, but at some point Dungeons & Dragons switched over to 4.0, everybody hated it, and Pathfinder carried on the 3.5 rules system in both their tabletop games and now finally Pathfinder, which you can play as its own standalone CRPG. They also, quite frankly, improved the 3.5 system infinitely, especially with the addition of archetypes to classes, whereas in 3.5 you had all these prestige classes. Archetypes were taking the base class and giving you about 500 different unique flavors of that original class, which you could even combine with themselves for basically infinite customization. Now, this wasn't new. In fact, you can go back and find this stuff in Baldurs Gate 2, but I'm so glad they added it to Dungeons & Dragons. Now, unlike the previous two games I mentioned, which are both sequels that are significantly superior to the original, both Pathfinder Kingmaker, Pathfinder 1, and Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous are great. It's not that one's better than the other. In fact, there's a continual online debate exactly which Pathfinder is better, but both of these games are actually just great games, and I recommend you play them both. It's difficult to pinpoint major differences, but in general, the original game is a little bit tighter in terms of its narrative. The budget was definitely smaller, but ultimately, it's still a fabulous game. And then you get into Wrath of the Righteous. It's like times 1,000 in terms of vistas and areas and crazy shit happening. But because they're both using exactly the same rule system, they are a true 1 and 2, which you probably should play in order. It's been a few years, but I believe Kingmaker is mostly voice acted, and I can certainly remember Wrath of the Righteous is almost entirely voice acted. I always have to mention it because I think it is great in terms of modern CRPGs. Most importantly of all, when it comes to these two games, yes, you got great characters, setting, story, but oh my god, if you remember way back at the beginning of this video, I said that character building is my crack cocaine. You cannot do any better for a game than these games. Pathfinder is a ridiculous layer upon layer of classes, archetypes, feats, origin traits, equipment, everything. It's nuts. And then when you go into Wrath of the Righteous, they have these things called mythic paths, which add like another 20 levels of complex character building to your main character. And I am not joking when I say that if you go to respec in Wrath of the Righteous, you can easily spend 30 to 45 minutes just respecing a single character. There are that many feats. It's that complicated, and I absolutely love it. It's great. Now, one downside I have to mention, just like every other masterpiece I've talked about, but that's okay because perfection is found through the imperfection of a beautiful piece of art. Both of these games are following so closely to the tabletop campaign, they also include these mini games within the original games. When it comes to Kingmaker, it's a kingdom management system. When it comes to Wrath of the Righteous, it's building armies to fight the demon armies invading the land. Now, for some people, this might be fabulous. It might be for their jam. For me, it wasn't. I had absolutely zero interest in these little mini games, which can take up a ton of time. I mean, God knows, you could probably spend 25 hours alone doing these mini games throughout the campaign. Luckily, in both games, there are options to turn those off, though you lose the loot. So quite frankly, you should just get a mod where you automatically win them. Could be your thing, but for me personally, baby, that's not what I'm here to do. Now, I do want to throw out 3 special mentions as games I highly recommend you play, CRPGs, but differ considerably enough that I wouldn't put them right next to Baldurs Gate 3. One is a small game called Tyranny, which is also made by Obsidian, the same producers of Deadfire, Pillars of Eternity. Tyranny is a very, very short game. There's an interesting story behind it, and it's kind of achieved, as the years have gone on, a bit of like a cult classic status. The biggest compliment I can give this game is it has one of the most fascinating, customizable magic systems that I've ever seen in an RPG anywhere. The story is interesting, but it's very short. It's a fun, like 2 or 3 days, just play through the game, and that's a good one. Now, it would be a discredit to me to make this video and not talk about Disco Elysium. Now, Disco Elysium is not only unlike any of these other CRPGs, it's probably going to be unlike any other game you've ever played. Most likely you've heard this game in passing. This is essentially taking a CRPG and taking out all of the combat. It's also placing you not in some kind of Lord of the Rings adventure It's an entirely unique, bizarre, neo-noir, French Marxist revolution kind of foggy town where you wake up as a detective and you have no memory. The whole game is based on dialogue. You're attempting to solve this great mystery. You go around the town, the outskirts, you interact with these bizarre and just amazingly well-written characters. I think for anyone who considers themselves a video game connoisseur, to not give this game a chance, not put it in your repertoire, is cheating yourself. It really is an incredible experience. And one note of warning, because I am a diehard min-maxer, right? I like to discover all the best skills and the combinations and stuff like that. And I made the mistake when it came to this game. So, you can actually level up, I think, 12 individual skills when it comes to dialogue. There's perception, there's logic, there's aggression, reflexes. There's one, I think it's like party or like sexiness. But I probably reset the game 5 times trying to map out this incredibly complex and doesn't really make any sense going to these random people at random times during the day to try to acquire skills which would give me more EXP to level up faster and create the ultimate character. I think this was a huge mistake looking back on it because I think I was cheating myself out of the amazing experience that this game is supposed to be and trying to make it this cut and dry power gaming experience when it really isn't. It's really about the journey. It's really about like this incredibly beautiful interactive novel. So I do recommend if you're going to play this, don't go on the wiki, don't look up, like what skills should I take here and there. Just build your character the way you want it to start and just go through the game. Have the experience. You're going to love it. One last modern CRPG I have to mention would be Wasteland III. Now, Wasteland III is a great game. It's a great CRPG. It is set in kind of a dystopian future Mad Max Borderlands 3 setting, which isn't necessarily my jam. I do like it, though I'm certainly more of a fantasy guy. My biggest issue with this game is the same issue I have with the Borderlands series. I don't know why everyone has to talk like a retarded teenager. I just don't get it. It seems like the writers are trying to be cool, but the characters just come off as idiots. Quite frankly, I don't like the dialogue. Outside of that, it's a really good game. It's a cool setting. There's really interesting character building options. It is a good story, and it is up there with some of the best CRPGs. And like every other game I mentioned on this list, you do not need to play Wasteland 1 and 2 to enjoy Wasteland 3. In fact, I wouldn't do it. So that concludes my list of what I would say are modern masterpiece CRPGs. No doubt there's a few I missed that people are like, hey, what about this? But these are the ones that I love and cannot recommend enough. And quite frankly, if you haven't played all of them and you play all of them, I think you just took care of yourself for the next 6 months or I don't know, maybe you have a job, maybe you don't. Maybe it'll only take you a couple of months to get through all of them. And so now I want to delve into the world of the old school CRPGs, which are still legitimately just, masterpieces. They've never been forgotten. They've stood the test of time. And if you can swallow your pride enough to say, let's deal with lesser, older graphics, non-voice acted, these are still gems, and you can absolutely milk them and still have a great time playing them. For me, the most important one on this list is absolutely Baldurs Gate 2. Everybody knows it's amazing. Now, I have a confession to make. I have not actually played Baldurs Gate 1, though as word of mouth is always the best criticism, everybody agrees Baldurs Gate 2 is, as Divinity Original Sin is 2, or Deadfire, it's just a huge upgrade. And I actually came quite late to this game. I was living in Taiwan in a little room, and I had a little laptop, and I loaded it up, and I swear to God, I did not leave the room for 2 weeks. It was so good. You've got those old school graphics, you don't have any voice acting, but it doesn't matter. The game is fascinating, the characters are amazing, the writing, the setting, it's great. The combat system, fun. Pause turn-based, like most of the ones I've mentioned. It is essentially the original masterpiece, and we had to wait 20 years for a sequel, which really isn't a sequel, it's its own standalone game, just like this one is. So do yourself a favor, you want to get old school, pick up Baldurs Gate 2, and as my usual one little nitpick, it does have an expansion. The expansion is not nearly as good as the main game, and that's mainly due to a deficit of story. It's a super heavily combat-focused expansion where you just basically go around and just start whacking and killing gods and stuff. But my god, the main game, what a great time. And important mention here, there is some voice acting. I forgot about that. There is voice acting in the heavy story beats, and David Warner of Star Trek fame plays the villain, and he's probably the most badass CRPG villain ever. Next on the list would definitely have to be Planescape Torment, which is definitely not voice acted. It is definitely an old game, but here's the thing. It doesn't have a complex combat system, it doesn't have a lot of modern amenities, but what it does have is an incredible story and setting. It's just fascinating. It will suck you into its world. It's set in these kind of strange undead lands and the lands of death. Can't miss it. Gotta load that one up, play it. Two more games that I have to mention, but have not played personally, are the original Fallout 1 and Fallout 2. They are on my bucket list, but every comment, every thread I've ever seen ranking CRPGs always have these two on there as masterpieces. I don't know why I haven't gotten around to it. Once again, probably a genre thing. I'm not so much into the dystopian past, but Fallout 1 and Fallout 2 are supposed to be classics, so give those a shot as well. And last but not least is Arcanum of Steamworks and Magica Obscura. And this is one more game I'm reluctant to admit I haven't played, and I need to. But once again, on every list, it's regarded as a masterpiece. When I look at the game, baby, this is an old game. This is going back to the crux of it. And quite frankly, it may be a line that I'm not quite ready to step over. You know, and it's not so much that it doesn't have voice acting. I mean, Final Fantasy VII didn't have voice acting, but it does look very old school. But from everything I've heard, it's amazing. So there you have it. That is my list of absolute must-play CRPGs. If you love Baldurs Gate 3, if you want to extend that experience and not go back to something with microtransactions and battle passes and a game that never ends, you want something with a wonderful story that does ultimately come to an end. It's a chapter that you can close in your life. Now, I do want to add at the end of this video a couple of non-CRPGs that I still think instill in you a similar experience to the game that you've just played. The first, ironically enough, is a Square Enix game. In my opinion, probably one of the only good Square Enix games to come up in 20 years, which is Final Fantasy XIV. And Final Fantasy XIV is not a CRPG, it's an MMORPG. But I have to stress that this experience is unlike pretty much any other MMORPG in the market and is much more closely related than you would think. The entire game follows a main quest, and it's no joke, it'll take you 100 to 200 hours to go from level 1 to max level following this main quest in the game. But the good news is, it's amazing. The story is fantastic. It's some of the best writing that have ever come to video games, especially Heavensward, the second expansion, but most especially Shadowbringers, the fourth expansion. Now, sadly, it does take a bit of a grind to get through, I think, the first main game. I think that's level 1 to 50. The story isn't that compelling, but if you can get past that filter, the game becomes amazing. And the great news in terms of combat, when you go into a raid with other people in a group finder, it's actually fairly complex and fun to master your character. So you've got the best of all worlds, in my opinion. Great story, voice acting, fabulous settings, interesting characters, character builds, combat. It's all there for you. So if you haven't taken a dive into this one yet, I think right now you can play the first 3 expansions completely for free, no strings attached. It's ridiculous. It'll take you 100 hours just to get through that. So something that I think you definitely want to check off your list. And what a shocker that the leader, the genius behind this game, is a passionate man with a creative vision. Secondly, I just have to add The Witcher 3. Now, I'm sure if you've been living under a rock for the past 10 years, you've probably heard of this game. But you may not have played it, and if you do, you're going to get a very similar experience to what you got with BG3 when it comes to story, when it comes to great characters. And the best news is, you don't actually have to play it. There are 15-hour YouTube video movies that cover The Witcher 3 and all of its expansions, and since I think this is where the real gold of the game is, the music, the setting, the story, the dialogue, you can just lay in your bed and watch it with the iPad, and you'll get 90% of the experience, and it's great. So do yourself a favor, put that on your list if you haven't. So since we've started to stray from CRPGs into just great games, there are certainly plenty of those, so I want to thank you guys for joining me. I think it is time to wrap this up. I hope this video did give you some value, and to be quite honest with you, if you've played everything but Deadfire, go play Deadfire, please! And you know, I think there is a big movement happening in games right now. People are getting tired of the microtransactions. It's similar to that video we've all seen of Steve Jobs talking about a product. All these giant video game corporations have lost sight of what made them great in the first place, and they're just all the marketers and psychologists are in charge now, just trying to milk the player base with nostalgia and get all the money that they can.
Blizzard is dead. It is a corpse. It is a corpse being puppeteered by Activision and Bobby Kotick. And it's going to be used as basically a factory to put the Blizzard stamp on things and stoke nostalgia to get sales. And that's it.
So take a step back. Have an amazing experience. Play these games. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a comment. If you didn't leave a comment, argue with me. I don't mind. I have fun doing it. And definitely consider subscribing so I can finally get monetized and my wife will love me again. Now, there is one more thing I want to say, and that is a super, super major spoiler for Baldurs Gate 3 that comes right on the end. So, if you have not finished Baldurs Gate 3, seriously, turn off this video now. This is going to ruin the game for you. But if you've beaten it, I want to talk about this. Okay, so now that the room is cleared, seriously, spoiler alert, spoiler alert. For those of you who have beat the game, Baldurs Gate 3, don't you wish Karlach had died? Really? What an amazing ending to that game. And I'm sorry, because don't get me wrong, I love Karlach. I fell in love with Karlach. Sadly, I was dating Shadowheart at the beginning of this game. Karlach to me was just kind of a tomboy, but as the game progressed, you just can't help but fall in love with her. She's such an awesome character. And when you get to that last minute of the game and she's dying, I was tearing up, and I was so disappointed that the game presented me an option to save her and her going to Avernus, because it goes against her character. The whole game she said, nope, I want to die. That's it. I don't want to go back to hell. And it's just, it would have been the perfect ending. It would have been an Arius from Final Fantasy VII level, just shocking moment that would have immortalized this game forever. Now, this game may already be immortalized forever, but I think this would have been just one last cherry on the top when it comes to an amazing story. So I'm a little sad that you could save her, but what can you do? And don't get me wrong, I wanted to save her. I was happy I could save her, but at the same time, if I put aside my personal bias, it's just so much better of a story. And, you know, there would have been memes going on into infinity where people don't beat the game just so they could keep her alive. But that's enough out of me for one day. Once again, thank you for joining me. Consider subscribing. I hope you enjoy all the wonderful CRPGs in your future, and I'm really happy about what the future might bring due to this game. Sure, maybe we gotta wait 5 years for the crop of new masterpiece CRPGs to come out, but I'm excited about it. Have a good day. See you guys later.